They called it the Castle, a prison designed to isolate and break even the hardest souls. I'd heard stories of Eastern State Penitentiary ever since I moved to Philadelphia of Al Capone's cell, the mad doctor who ran experiments on inmates, and the lingering echoes of thousands of prisoners who'd spent their lives in its cold, crumbling walls. My friends and I decided we had to see it for ourselves. After all, it was open for tours, and there was something thrilling about stepping into such a notorious place. The tour guide's voice droned on about its history, but I could barely concentrate. As we moved through the labyrinth of empty cells, I felt like I was being watched. The cells themselves were tiny, dark rooms with a single narrow slot for food. Some were covered in graffiti from inmates long gone, while others held eerie relics, a dusty mattress, an old metal cot, a few forgotten belongings. Even in the daylight, the place had an unsettling chill. The strangest part was the silence. The penitentiary was built for total isolation, and even now, the sound was swallowed by the thick walls and endless corridors. Our footsteps seemed muffled, our voices muted. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a quick shadow darting from one cell to another, but when I looked, nothing was there. We reached cell block 12, the one they say is the most haunted. According to the guide, this was where some of the worst riots happened, where prisoners went mad from isolation, hearing voices and scratching at the walls until their fingers bled. He mentioned that some guards reported hearing whispers and laughter even after the prison closed down. As we entered the cell block, I noticed a strange, stale smell in the air, a mix of damp concrete and something rotten. It seemed to get stronger the deeper we went. The hallway was lined with cells on both sides, each one stretching back into shadows that our flashlights barely reached. Some cells were barred, while others were closed with solid metal doors that made me wonder what or who they had once kept in there. My friend Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I did. It felt colder in here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I shivered, but shrugged it off, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. We turned a corner, and that's when we heard a faint shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. I looked down the hall, but it was empty. Just rows and rows of cells, each one filled with nothing but darkness. My friend Jake, who'd been trying to scare us all day, grinned and said, "Probably just a rat." But there was a tension in his voice that told me he was just as freaked out as the rest of us. Then we heard a voice, a low, whispering voice coming from one of the cells up ahead. The words were too soft to make out, but it sounded like someone mumbling, almost like they were talking to themselves. We crept forward, trying to figure out which cell it was coming from. I leaned in, squinting into the darkness, and saw nothing, just an empty cell, the walls covered in old, faded graffiti. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. The silence settled in again, thick and suffocating. Just as we were about to move on, the voice started up again, louder this time. It was a raspy, gasping sound, filled with anger and pain. My heart started pounding as I realized it was coming from the cell right beside us, the one we'd thought was empty. We backed away, but as we did, the door of the cell creaked, swinging open just a crack. Inside, I could see something in the darkness, a shadow that looked human. It moved slowly, its head jerking in unnatural angles, as if struggling to see us through eyes that were long gone. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, slamming against the bars, rattling them so hard that the sound echoed through the cell block. We screamed, stumbling backward, our flashlights shaking as we pointed them at the cell. But by the time the light hit it, the shadow was gone. In a panic, we ran, racing through the twisting corridors, the whispers following us with every step. I could still hear the rattling sound behind us, echoing off the walls as if something was giving chase. When we finally reached the exit, gasping for air, we turned back to see nothing but darkness. The eerie silence had returned, and the cell block stood as still as death. To this day, I'm not sure what we saw in that cell. Maybe it was just shadows, tricks of the mind. But when I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper, that horrible, angry voice echoing through the hallways. It felt like the place itself was alive, watching us, warning us to leave. Or, worse, waiting for us to stay. I'd always wanted to stay at the Stanley Hotel. Being a lifelong horror fan, the place had a kind of magnetic pull for me. When my girlfriend Emily suggested we take a weekend trip to Estes Park, I jumped at the chance to book a room at the hotel. She wasn't exactly thrilled at the idea, but she was up for the adventure. When we arrived, the place looked exactly how I'd imagined, grand and beautiful, but with a certain eeriness. The whole building was cloaked in the crisp Colorado mountain air, and the low mist seemed to cling to the ground, giving it an otherworldly feel. Our room was on the 4th floor, rumored to be one of the most haunted in the hotel. Room 418, the front desk staff warned us, had a reputation. People reported strange noises, unexplained drafts, and even sightings of ghostly children playing in the halls. That first night, we settled in, still buzzing from the excitement of staying at such a famous haunted hotel. But as we unpacked, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that we were being watched. The room was charming but cold, even with the heat on. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to nerves or an overactive imagination. After dinner, we returned to the room, exhausted. We both fell asleep quickly, but it didn't last long. At around 1 in the morning, I jolted awake to the sound of something thumping against the wall. It was rhythmic, a steady tapping that seemed to come from inside the wall right next to the bed. "Emily," I whispered, nudging her. She stirred but didn't wake up. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out if it was a pipe or something mechanical. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded intentional, like someone was tapping in some kind of pattern, trying to get attention. Finally, I shook Emily awake. "Do you hear that?" I asked. She sat up, blinking groggy. Then she heard it too, a soft scratching noise, followed by another tap. Her eyes widened. "Is there something in the walls?" I got up, walked over to the wall, and knocked, hoping it might be an old radiator or something. But the wall was cold and solid, with no pipes nearby. Then, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. We both stared at each other, unsure of what to do. Just then, we heard another noise, laughter, faint and high-pitched, like a child's giggle, coming from somewhere in the hallway. I grabbed the flashlight, opened the door, and stepped out, hoping to find some logical explanation. The hallway was empty and silent, the carpeted floor absorbing my footsteps. Emily joined me, peering over my shoulder, her face pale. Just as I was about to go back inside, I caught a flicker of movement at the end of the hall. A small figure, maybe the size of a child, darted across the corridor and vanished around the corner. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her hand gripping my arm tightly. I nodded, swallowing hard. We backed into the room and locked the door, both too spooked to talk. Emily tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the room with us. I lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, my heart pounding. Around 3 in the morning, just as I was starting to drift off, I felt a strange pressure on the bed, like someone was sitting down. My eyes shot open. I didn't see anything at first. Then, I noticed a faint indentation on the blanket near my feet, as if an invisible hand was pressing down. My throat went dry, and I didn't dare move. Emily was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. I reached out, trying to shake her awake, but before I could, I heard it again, the laughter. This time, it was right in the room, close enough that I could feel the breath on my neck. Panicking, I sat up, flicking on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, but the laughter echoed in my ears, fading slowly until it disappeared. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, the light on, my heart pounding. In the morning, Emily woke up, looking just as exhausted as I felt. She said she'd had nightmares of children laughing and shadows moving in the room. We both agreed to leave a day early. The Stanley's charm had faded quickly, replaced by a feeling of dread that neither of us could shake. On our way out, I mentioned our experience to the receptionist, half expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she nodded solemnly and said, "Room 418 is known for visitors, especially younger ones." She paused, adding, "You wouldn't be the first to leave early." We drove away in silence, but the laughter and tapping stayed with us long after we'd left. I still dream about it sometimes, the sound of small footsteps echoing down the hallway, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that room wasn't ready to let us go. I'd always wanted to visit the Winchester Mystery House. The photos of twisting halls, staircases leading to nowhere, and doors opening into thin air had fascinated me for years. So, when my cousin Grace and I found ourselves near San Jose, we couldn't pass up the chance to see it. We booked a late-night tour, hoping to experience some of the paranormal activity that others had claimed to encounter. When we arrived, the mansion was even more unsettling in person. It was massive, looming against the night sky, with hundreds of windows glinting in the dim light. Inside, the place felt oddly claustrophobic. The walls seemed to press in, and the silence was thick. Our guide, an older man with a serious expression, led us through narrow hallways and past rooms that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. "This house was built to confuse the spirits," the guide explained, his voice low. "Sarah Winchester believed she was haunted by those killed by her family's rifles. So she kept building day and night for years, hoping to appease them. They say she designed the house to be a trap, to keep the spirits from finding her." Grace and I exchanged nervous glances. The guide's words had cast a chill over the tour. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the drafty halls, felt like a ghostly presence trailing behind us. As we made our way through the mansion, we came to a narrow staircase that spiraled sharply downward. The guide led us down, warning us to mind our steps. "This leads to one of the more active rooms," he said. "Many people feel a strong presence here, like they're not alone." We entered a small room with a single dusty chair in the middle, facing a blank wall. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't say exactly why. Grace walked in first, looking around with curiosity, but her face changed when she stopped in front of the chair. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I walked up beside her and immediately understood. The room was colder than the rest of the house, and there was a strange heaviness in the air, like it was pressing down on us. I felt goosebumps prickle my arms, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Suddenly, we heard a faint sound behind us, like soft footsteps padding down the hallway. We turned around, but no one was there. The guide was on the other side of the room, talking to another couple on the tour, clearly not responsible for the sound. "Let's keep moving," Grace muttered, visibly unsettled. We slipped back into the hallway, catching up to the group, but the feeling didn't go away. As we walked, I had the eerie sensation that the layout had changed. We'd passed through so many twisting corridors, strange rooms, and dead ends that I was losing my sense of direction. Then, the lights flickered. The hallway plunged into darkness for a moment before the dim glow returned, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift. "Did the lights just?" Grace whispered, looking around. But the guide kept moving unfazed, leading us deeper into the house. As we followed, I started noticing things that felt wrong. Doors we'd already passed that were now closed, a room that seemed to have two exits that led to different hallways. My heart began to pound. The mansion was like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. "Are we lost?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The guide stopped and turned, his face serious. "People often feel that way in here. It's disorienting. Just stay close, and we'll get to the exit." But as we walked, I noticed he was moving faster. His face had gone pale, and he kept glancing back like he, too, felt the oppressive weight that was following us. Just then, we heard it again, the footsteps, closer this time. They echoed down the hall, loud and deliberate, like someone was trailing us. "Hello?" Grace called, her voice shaky. No answer, just silence. But then, we saw a shadow in the hallway behind us, moving slowly toward us. I couldn't make out a face, but there was something unmistakably human about the shape, like a figure from another time, stuck here, wandering endlessly through the halls. Panicked, we followed the guide as he led us in a hurry through the twisting maze of hallways and doors. But no matter which way we went, the figure was always just behind us, sometimes visible in the corner of my eye, other times gone when I turned to look. It was as if the house itself was guiding us in circles, keeping us trapped. Finally, we reached a staircase that led back up to the main floor. We raced up, gasping, the guide finally breaking his silence. "This place," he said, his voice low. "It has a way of keeping people. Some never find their way out." When we burst out into the main lobby, the warmth and light hit us like a wave. But even as we left, I could still feel the weight of that dark, twisting maze behind me. I glanced back at the mansion one last time, and I swore I saw a shadow at the window, watching us, as if it were waiting for us to come back inside.